My name is Stephen Benke, and I am going to be introducing Professor Elyn Sachs for our talk today. I'd like to begin by thanking Dr. Jeff Youngren for inviting me to introduce today's Grounds Round speaker, Professor Sachs. It's a great honor and pleasure for me to do this introduction, and I certainly very much appreciate Dr. Youngren's many years of friendship.
I'll click this to my,
Yes.
Professor Sachs is Orrin B. Evans Distinguished Professor of Law, Psychology, Psychiatry, and the Behavioral Sciences at the University of Southern California Gould School of Law. She is founder and faculty director of the USC Sachs Institute for Mental Health, Law Policy, and Ethics. She's adjunct professor of psychiatry at the UC San Diego School of Medicine, where she collaborates with Dr. Dilip Jesti, and she's faculty at the New Center for Psychoanalysis in Los Angeles. Professor Sachs also teaches at the Keck School of Medicine at USC. Professor Sachs has published 5 books and more than 50 articles and book chapters on law and mental health. Her research has included the ethical dimensions of psychiatric research and forced treatment of people with mental illness. Her memoir, The Center Cannot Hold: My Journey Through Madness, gives a vivid first-person account of the lived experience of a person with schizophrenia. Professor Sachs has won numerous honors, including a 2009 John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Fellowship, the so-called Genius Award. Her TED Talk has been viewed over 5.5 million times. But enough about Professor Sachs. Please let me tell you about Elyn. I've known Elyn for nearly 40 years, since we sat together in contracts class in our first year of law school. Elyn's life experiences have always informed her work. In law school, Elyn published her law journal article on the use of mechanical restraints in psychiatric hospitals. Elyn's article did not mention Elyn's personal history of being restrained at the Yale Psychiatric Institute, a short walk from the law school where Elyn and I sat next to one another in class. She was not yet out at that point in her life. Indeed, at that point in her life, Elyn was determined to keep her illness hidden, understandably fearful of what might happen were others to know about her illness. Many years later, after she had received tenure, Elyn published her memoir, The Center Cannot Hold, an unsparing account of her life with schizophrenia. The book changed Elyn's lives and the lives of many others. Today, Elyn is an eloquent and powerful spokesperson for people with lived experience of a psychotic illness. Alongside her academic responsibilities, Elyn spends many hours each week with people whose lives mental illness has touched. Elyn always has time for an encouraging word to anyone who reaches out to her. A vocation has arisen out of Elyn's academic career. As Elyn will share in her remarks today, accepting her mental illness was a lifelong project. That acceptance reached to the core of her identity as a scholar and as a woman, profoundly affecting each, but far from the way she had expected. Elyn, thank you for speaking to us today.
Thank you so very much for that kind introduction. And I'd also like to thank the University of New Mexico Department of Medicine, Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences, for inviting me to speak at Grand Rounds today. It's truly an honor to be here. I would especially like to thank Dr. Jeff Youngren, who reached out to ask whether I might be available to speak at your Grand Rounds. And of course, my answer was yes, knowing of the close relationship between Dr. Youngren and my good friend, Dr. Stephen Benke. I have lived with schizophrenia, let me just see something, for the past 45 years. I've spent hundreds of days in psychiatric hospitals. I was given a, quote, grave prognosis and was told that I would live in a board and care were I well enough to stay out of the hospital. Had I been born even 20 years earlier, that's almost certainly where I would be today. But things have turned out differently for me. Good psychiatric treatment has kept me alive. Sensitive and wise psychiatric treatment has allowed me to flourish. People who struggle with mental health disorders are not just walking symptoms that can be cured by a pill. Mental health and mental illness involve whole people who live in relational, social, and political contexts. We must understand people in the richness and the fullness of their lives. The title of my talk today is Making Friends with My Schizophrenia, a Lifelong Project. My title is an attempt to convey that schizophrenia is a relational illness. By relational, I mean that it involves personal identity, that it profoundly implicates one's social world, and that it has political meanings as well. That's what I want to address today, the identity, the social, and the political aspects of schizophrenia. My title, Making Friends with My Schizophrenia, a Lifelong Project, is therefore intended to convey that I have a relationship with my illness, that the nature of this relationship affects my social world, and that how I conceptualize the role of this illness and how I respond according to that conceptualization is, among other things, a political issue. In my brief remarks today, I want to address these three aspects of mental illness, and I'll be doing that by using excerpts from my memoir, The Center Cannot Hold, My Journey Through Madness, as a window into these issues. And I have left time at the end for a discussion and eager to hear your thoughts on my reflections. I first became seriously ill as a Marshall Scholar studying ancient philosophy at Oxford University. At first, it seemed that I had a depression with mild psychotic features, which, as you know, is often how schizophrenia begins. But then my illness evolved into a pure thought disorder. Despite much resistance, I eventually found my way to a psychiatric hospital with strong encouragement from my doctors at the university, whom I'd seen at the urging of a friend who's himself a neurologist. I had graduated as class valedictorian at Vanderbilt, had been accepted as a Marshall Scholar to Oxford, but I was in terrible shape. I spent much of my time wandering the streets of Oxford, gesticulating incoherently and mumbling to myself, and contemplating various ways to commit suicide to rid the world of my evil. I had absolutely no insight into the severity of my condition. I had no awareness that there might be a gap between how I saw myself and how others saw me. I entered the hospital voluntarily. After about a week or two there, everything changed. It wasn't something a friend or a doctor or a fellow patient said. It was a simple look into a mirror. I saw myself, reading from the text of my book. It was the first time I'd actually seen myself in weeks, and it felt as if someone had punched me in the stomach. Good God, I thought, who is that? I was emaciated and hunched over like someone 3 or even 4 times my age. My face was gaunt. My eyes were simultaneously vacant and full of terror. My hair was wild and filthy. My clothes wrinkled and stained. It was the visage of a crazy person on the long forgotten back ward of a hospital for lunatics. Ending the passage. The gap between who I imagined myself to be and whom I saw in the mirror that day was profound and unavoidable. Far from making friends with my mental illness, until that moment, I did not truly understand that I had a mental illness to make friends with. That moment, that look in the mirror, was the beginning of a journey that would last 4 decades. In retrospect, it's no accident that the song I chose to listen to over and over on the psych ward after that experience was the Beatles' "Once There Was a Way to Get Back Homeward, Once There Was a Way to Get Back Home." I needed to find my way back home. I think Freud was a brilliant thinker and he got many things right. What I don't think Freud got right is his view that intense talk therapy is not helpful for people who are psychotic. According to Freud, analysis was not appropriate for psychotic patients because an individual who is actively psychotic could not form a transference to the analyst. Freud's view is absolutely not consistent with my experience. In my experience, the need to be in a relationship, to be part of a social world, may be most profound precisely when someone is psychotic. So please let me say this point again. When a person is psychotic is when the person may be feeling most scared and alone. That is when relationship can be so most important. I began my first work with a psychoanalyst at Oxford, and it was difficult, painful work. What I noticed from my first experience with intensive talk therapy is 2 things. First, my analyst was hugely helpful in diffusing a sense of shame that went along with the thoughts I was having. My thoughts were violent and deeply disturbing about myself and other people. My analyst, I'll call Mrs. Jones, was able to tolerate everything. It's difficult for me adequately to convey how helpful it was to me to have a therapist who could listen, not judge me, and not threaten to put me in the hospital or call the police. I felt safe with her. Second, I noticed that as I felt more related to my analyst, Mrs. Jones, I began to make friends and found it easier to work again. As I became able to share my internal experience, my ability to interact with the world around me got better. I want to notice and emphasize that the 2 most helpful the most helpful consultant I had in England said 2 things. First, I needed to be in an intensive psychotherapy. And second, I should be back at school as a way to exercise my mind. Most people were saying I should leave Oxford and go home. He was right, and I will be forever grateful to that consultant. As I like to say, my mind has been both my best friend and my worst enemy. That consultant understood that nurturing my mind offered me a path forward in life. I finished my degree at Oxford and I came back to the States to study law at Yale. My transition was rocky. For someone not familiar with a psychotic illness, it's difficult to understand that at this point, I still really didn't believe that I had a mental illness. I thought that I was somehow different from other people, and not in a good way, but that through the exercise of willpower, I could tame whatever was wrong. Quite literally, like one has a wild horse in a corral that you must tame. The challenge, as I framed it at that point in my life, was to take that woman whom I'd seen in that mirror at Oxford and tame her and groom her, or maybe just make sure she always stayed at home when I went out. I was not mentally ill. I was socially maladroit. So I began Yale Law School. I was not in treatment, nor was I on medication. As a side note, my Oxford analyst, Mrs. Jones, had never suggested I consider medication. Within several weeks after law school began, I became overwhelmed. One night, in the library of the Yale Law School, I became quite psychotic, and the following day, I ended up being taken to the hospital by one of my professors, whose assignment had sent me over the edge. At the hospital, I found myself in a small private room waiting for a doctor. The attendant was kind, and I readily gave him a telephone wire belt, which I had made the evening before, when I'd been floridly psychotic at the roof of the Yale Law School, and, not satisfied with my jeans and bland t-shirt, I decided I should accessorize. I had also picked up a nail that I had found, and I kept the nail in my pocket. Many people who are psychotic carry things which can be used as weapons, not because they want to hurt someone, but because they are afraid that someone might want to hurt them. The visit to the emergency room resulted in my first hospitalization in America. Reading from the text. "But you can't have my 6-inch nail," I said, patting my pocket. Then someone whom I'll call the doctor arrived. "Give that to me," he ordered. "No," I said. The doctor immediately called for security. Another attendant came in, this one not so nice. Once he pried the nail from my fingers, I knew I was done for. Within seconds, the doctor and his whole team of goons swooped down, grabbed me, lifted me out of the chair, and slammed me down in a nearby bed with such force that I saw stars. Then they bound both my legs and arms to the metal bed with thick leather straps. A sound came out of my mouth that I'd never heard before. Half groan, half scream, barely human, and pure terror. Then the sound came again, forced from somewhere deep inside my belly and scraping my throat raw. "No," I shouted, "stop this, don't do this to me." I glanced up to see a face watching the entire scene through the window in the steel door. Why was she watching me? Who was she? I was an exhibit, a specimen, a bug impaled on a pin and helpless to escape. "Please," I begged, "please, this is like something from the Middle Ages. Please, don't do this to me," ending the passage. Shame is a pervasive experience of people with psychosis. Often we're ashamed of what we're thinking, and so we hide our thoughts from other people. This shame may play itself out in different ways. After my experience in the emergency room, 5 months of hospitalization ensued. Hospitalization involving long-term restraints and seclusion, forcible medication, and no privacy. In the beginning, I was even watched as I showered and went to the bathroom, and was not allowed privacy while talking to other people, including my parents. I believe that the hands-off approach of the British hospital, perhaps it could be described as benign neglect even, was preferable to the over-interventionist approach, often driven by risk management concerns of the American hospitals. I do believe that force may have an appropriate, though limited, role in psychiatric treatment, but force should not be confused with treatment. Reflecting on my experience in American psychiatric hospitals, I do not believe that the use of force helped me move forward toward healing, toward accepting that I had a mental illness, or toward agreeing to take medicine. In fact, I think the use of force had precisely the opposite effect for me. As I have come to say, I am very pro-psychiatry, but very anti-force. After 2 weeks on an emergency commitment, I was faced with the question of whether I would try to get out of the hospital. The doctors put me on an emergency commitment because they said I was, quote, dangerous to myself and others, and because they said I was, quote, gravely disabled. The reason they gave for me being gravely disabled was that I couldn't do my Yale Law School homework, which made me wonder about the rest of New Haven, much of the rest of New Haven. I could contest their motion to civilly commit me. To me, the choice seemed clear. I would demand a hearing to fight the commitment. I brought this up to my father, who's also an attorney. My father was equally clear. Don't contest this, because if you lose, you have now been civilly committed, and you're going to have to report your commitment every time you apply for a license to practice law. He said to me, quote, "You certainly don't want anything in your record where a judge orders you to stay in the hospital," unquote. When I speak about the political dimensions of schizophrenia, I speak not only about the social stigma, which is real and pervasive. I also speak about these life events that can follow an individual with schizophrenia for decades. There are profound political aspects to this illness that can become huge burdens that people with schizophrenia carry, and it's important that you, who work with people with schizophrenia, are aware of them. The stigma of mental illness can follow a person for a lifetime. And I found that stigma to be pervasive. When I returned to Yale Law School, I decided to write an article for the Law Journal on the use of mechanical restraints in psychiatric hospitals. I approached a law school faculty member who was also a psychiatrist and explained my project to him without giving any of my personal history. I said that I believed mechanical restraints would be painful and degrading. His response to me was, "You don't understand, Elyn. These people are psychotic. They aren't like you and me. They wouldn't experience restraints in the way we would." I did not have the courage in that moment to tell him, "These people are just like you and me, and that's exactly how they would experience restraints." I'll share one other brief anecdote about stigma. I went to the ER with what turned out to be a subarachnoid hemorrhage. I was confused and incoherent. The ER folks learned about my psychiatric history and thought I was having a psychotic episode. Fortunately, my friends who were with me, who accompanied me to the ER, and told them that they'd seen me psychotic many times and this is not what that looked like. And they were able to convince the doctors otherwise. I was very lucky to have had those friends with me. Otherwise, I would imagine that I would have been told to take more of my medication and would have been sent home. So we've discussed personal identity aspects of the illness. We've talked about the social aspects of the illness, and we've touched upon the political aspects. I want to push these ideas further by talking about the centrality of relationship to healing. Healing does not occur in isolation. It's painful to me when I talk with mental health professionals working in community mental health centers who measure their caseloads in the hundreds. I have a friend who had 350 patients. How on earth do you do that? Healing begins in relationship, and in all kinds of ways, a patient's relationship with a mental health professional is an integral part of the healing. I worry tremendously that this point has been lost on our policymakers. Of course, other relationships are healing as well. After I was hospitalized upon returning to the US, I took the rest of that year off, what would have been my first year at Yale Law School, and then I returned the following year to begin again. It was when I began Yale Law School a second time that I made my closest friend and a man named Stephen Benke, who introduced my talk today. Steve is an attorney and a clinical psychologist with an appointment in clinical ethics at Harvard's Department of Psychiatry. Reading from the text. One of the worst aspects of schizophrenia is the profound isolation, the constant awareness that you're different, some sort of alien, not really human. Other people have flesh and bones and insides made of and organs made of healthy living tissue. You are only a machine with insides made of metal. Medication and talk therapy allay this terrible feeling, but friendship can be as powerful as either. Steve and I were in contrast class together, and a couple of times he had asked me for an assignment. Other than that, we'd never really spoken. One evening, we sat at the same table in the law school dining hall. The conversation that night in the law school dining hall was casual and pleasant, drifting from one subject to another, classes and law journal and summer jobs. I noticed that Steve seemed engaged enough. He nodded, he smiled. But after a while, it began to look like simple politeness. As our classmates got up to leave the table, I realized I wasn't ready to go just yet. And there began one of those conversations that lasts for a lifetime, one in which there's immediate comfort and acceptance, the equivalent of someone's strong hand offered to you when you most need to grasp it. That first talk flew far and wide. How we got to Yale, who our families were, then philosophy and religion, and what mattered to us and why. Steve had majored in classics at Princeton, where he was named salutatorian in his class and spoke in Latin at graduation. The summer after graduation, he worked as a janitor at a small town airport, and then he went to Rome, where he lived with a group of Benedictine monks and read Latin at the Vatican with a monk who served as a Pope's Latinist. He had considered entering the monastery and studying medieval philosophy, but decided against it because medieval philosophy had ceased to hold his interest, at least for a lifetime endeavor. Instead of becoming a monk, Steve came to Yale Law School, and so did I. And neither one of us was quite sure why. Sometime later, it occurred to me that at the very moment I was being tied to a bed in a psychiatric ward, screaming bloody murder and afraid for my life, Steve was singing Gregorian chant in a monastery overlooking the ancient city of Rome. And here we were now, come to the same place from two very different directions. It was past midnight when we said goodnight, and as I walked back to my room, I had the distinct feeling in the middle of my usual muddle that I'd been unexpectedly blessed. I don't know why I decided to tell Steve the truth about myself. I don't know why I thought I could trust him. But I did. I believe from our very first conversation that this man would be a significant friend and a force for good in my life. Once the possibility came to my mind, I realized how much I wanted it to be so. But I didn't believe that could happen unless I revealed the truth about myself and let him see me in full. So much of what I did on a daily basis was about faking it. I knew that I would never fake it with him. And so, on a rainy afternoon at a pizzeria in New Haven, I shared my history. Aside from doctors and therapists, it was the first time I'd ever done this with anyone, anywhere. Ending the passage. Without Steve's support, I could not have made it so successfully through school, if indeed I could have made it at all. Steve was a second set of eyes who could see me slipping when I couldn't. He was a rock who could support me when I was about to fall. And he was a true friend who helped me find meaning and pleasure in my life when meaning and pleasure felt like distant memories. After Steve had graduated from law school and left New Haven, my then analyst, I'll call Dr. White, announced that he was going to close his practice in 3 months, fully 2 years before I planned to leave. The news of White's leaving shattered me. Again, I returned to what I see as Freud's mistaken view that psychotic patients don't form transferences with their analysts. In fact, my transferences were quite powerful, and the end of my first 2 analytic relationships could easily have landed me in the hospital. Fortunately, neither did. When White gave me the news of his planned early retirement, Steve was traveling around the country, interviewing for PhD programs in clinical psychology. He had said something was terribly wrong, and he came to New Haven to see me. Reading from the text. I opened the door of my studio apartment. Steve would tell me later that for all the times he'd seen me psychotic, what he saw that day shocked him. For a week or more, I had barely eaten. I was gaunt and moved as though my legs were wooden. My face looked and felt like a mask. Since I pulled down all the shades, the apartment in the middle of the afternoon was in near total darkness. The air was fetid, the place was a shambles. Steve has worked with many patients who suffer from severe mental illness. To this day, he'll tell me on that afternoon, I looked as bad as he'd ever seen. Hi, I said, then returned to the couch, where I was silent for several minutes. Thank you for coming, Steve, I finally said. Crumbling world, word, voice, tell the clocks to stop. Time has come. White is leaving, Steve said somberly. I'm being pushed into a grave. The situation is grave, I moan. Gravity is pulling me down. Tell them to get away. I'm scared. Ending the passage. Healing takes place in many forms and in many venues. I could not have survived this illness without close friends, family, and colleagues who have known me over the course of my illness and who have been there to help me. Healing takes place in relationship. At this point, I want to mention a project of the Sachs Institute, that of supported decision-making. Our research focuses on supporting individuals with lived experience as they make treatment decisions. The goal of our research is to explore whom individuals choose to help them make these important decisions. We believe that supported decision-making will enhance an individual's ability to exercise their autonomy by including trusted friends in the decision-making process. At the risk of sounding like a broken record, please let me say as plainly as I can. Our approaches and our policies must be based on the centrality of relationships to healing. Perhaps that sounds soft-headed, but relationships are what saved my life, and I believe that relationships are where healing begins. As wonderful as Steve was and is, he was a friend like a brother. Around the time I had received tenure, or shortly after, I ran into a man named Will, a man who I thought was handsome, friendly, and smart, a man with whom I tried to flirt several times when I was working toward tenure and he was working in the law library at USC. It had been over a decade, actually it had been 18 years since I'd been on a date. My inner demons had left no room in my life for romance. I mustered my courage and asked if he'd like to have lunch sometime, reading from the text. When it came to my personal life after my illness had quieted down somewhat, I started nurturing a fragile but a growing hope for a relationship with a man named Will, a librarian at USC and an artist. I had tried flirting with him to no avail. Who knew how to do that? But after he left USC, he invited me to lunch. And then he invited me to see the California Poppy Reserve in Lancaster, not far from Los Angeles. I kept saying I was kind of cold, hinting that he should put his arm around me, but he didn't get the message and I felt kind of deflated. But when we arrived home, he gave me a long, lingering kiss goodnight. And the thought I had, and this is literally the thought that went through my mind was, this is even better than getting an article accepted. The next day, Will brought me a feather from his parrot, which he pasted on my computer. That night, I asked my close Vanderbilt friend Kenny whether he thought that a guy plucking a feather from his bird to paste it on your computer meant that he liked you. To which Kenny responded without skipping a beat, "I don't know, Elyn, but one thing for sure, he likes you better than he likes his bird," which actually wasn't true at that point. I wanted a relationship with Will, and slowly I began to believe that it actually might happen. Eventually, I told Will that I loved him, and indeed, that he was the first man I had ever loved in that way. He said that made him feel very sad. At the right moment, I told him about my illness, and he responded as gently and kindly as a person could. If Steve's friendship made me feel human, Will was making me feel like a woman. Ending the passage. When I say my relationship with Steve made me feel human, please don't take that metaphorically. I did not feel like a human. I felt my insides were made of metal and that things that happened to other people, the feelings other people had, weren't part of my life. I believed I was something else, a machine. Please understand how shaming this experience would be for one of your patients to tell you. It was those two relationships with Steve and Will which brought me not simply to think, but to feel that I am human and I am capable of loving relationships. Today, Steve and Will are my closest friends, and I think of them as my two pillars. But there was a point where I thought I may have lost Steve. I suffered from an episode of Capgras syndrome in which you believe that a person has been taken over by someone or something else. That person is no longer really that person, akin to the film Invasion of the Body Snatchers, if any of you have happened to see it. The Capgras episode happened to me in the mid-90s when I was in intense struggle with my analyst, Dr. Kaplan, about how much medication I should be. As was often the case in my treatments, struggles about real-world practical issues, such as how many pills I would take, had delusional counterparts. The struggle over medication, which many psychiatric people experience, and other struggles with Dr. Kaplan, left me with violent fantasies about what I wanted to do to him, and I experienced vivid fantasies about ways I could hurt him. These thoughts got talked about in the therapy. Talking about my violent thoughts helped diffuse them, but in this case, the struggle was intense enough that my delusional thinking had overwhelmed me. Dr. Kaplan and I reached a compromise about how much medication I would take, which I was not happy with, but to which I agreed. The Capgras symptoms dissipated, but they left me and Will and Steve shaken. The only way to understand why the Capgras episode was so disturbing to me is to understand that the relationship with Steve and Will were a tether to my own humanness. If I lost these ties to my humanness, I might really no longer be human. Again, I'm not speaking in metaphor here. I really didn't believe I was human. So I've been talking here about myself and relationship. I would like to say a few more words about my relationship with my mental illness and how I conceptualize that relationship. When I moved to Los Angeles from New Haven, my analyst and I developed a way of talking, a sort of heuristic about my illness and my relationship to my illness. There were, in our manner of speaking, three me's. We're not talking about multiple personality kind of things, but just different aspects of myself. There was Elyn, there was Professor Sachs, and there was the lady of the medical charts. I could not integrate these three aspects of myself. How could I be a thinker of big thoughts, an academic, if my mind were so damaged? How could I be both Professor Sachs and the lady of the medical charts? And where did Elyn fit in all this? What took a huge amount of effort and what was ultimately self-defeating was to keep them separate. I wasn't sure who was the real me. This confusion expressed itself in an intense ambivalence toward taking my medication. For many years, my motto was, the less medicine, the less effective. I believed that if I could get by without medication, then I didn't really have a mental illness. Steve was virtually a saint, as he spent literally years of our relationship going through time and time again when I tried to get off my medication with disastrous results. It wasn't simply I did not like the side effects of my meds. The need to take medication reached deep to the core of my identity. If I could get by without medication, I wasn't really mentally ill, and the lady of the charts would disappear. Only Elyn and the professor would be left as a real me. This cycle culminated in one final effort to get off medication several years after I had been on the faculty at USC. Reading from the text. While Dr. Wright had supported me many times in my efforts to get off medication, which I undertook with great gusto and failed miserably at each time, one battle between Kaplan and me concerned the use of meds. Early on, we really locked horns over this. Kaplan thought I should just stay on the meds and get on with my life. For me, again, the motto of the less medicine, the less effective held sway. Part of the way I could prove I wasn't mentally ill, which I resisted mightily for many years, was to get off medication. And so I kept trying and trying and trying. I decided to make one last effort to get off. I thought I had never really tried hard enough, and I put lots of extra supports in place to help keep myself be true to my goals. And so I started the reduction. I hid what I was feeling when I started to feel bad. The days and nights were harder now. The sheer physical effort of containing my body and my thoughts felt like trying to hold back a team of wild horses. Sleep was spotty and filled with dreams that left me awake and sweating in terror. Nevertheless, I dropped down again. Months before, I had accepted an invitation to present at a workshop at Oxford. By the time I boarded the plane for home, I was a complete wreck. When I walked into Kaplan's office my first day back, I headed straight for the corner, crouched down on the floor, and began to shake. All around me were thoughts of evil beings poised with daggers. They'd slice me up in thin slices or make me swallow hot coals. Kaplan would later describe me as, quote, writhing in agony. Even in this state, what he accurately described as acutely and forwardly psychotic, I refused to take more meds. The mission is not yet complete. Immediately after the appointment with Dr. Kaplan, I went to see Dr. Martyr, a schizophrenia expert who was following me for a movement disorder caused by the meds, namely tardive dyskinesia. He'd never seen me ill before. He'd been under the impression, and I hadn't disabused him of it, that I had a mild psychotic illness and that my primary concern was avoiding or at least minimizing tardive dyskinesia. Once in his office, I sat on his couch, folded over, and began muttering. I was disheveled. I couldn't remember when I'd slept or what I'd eaten. When had I bathed? In Oxford? Before Oxford? Did it matter if we were all going to die anyway? Anyone who walked into that room would have thought Martyr was treating a schizophrenic street person. Weeks later, people told me that's exactly what I looked like. Head explosions and people trying to kill. Is it okay if I totally trash your office? You need to leave if you're going to do that, said Martyr. Okay, small, fire on ice. Tell them not to kill me. Tell them not to kill me. What have I done wrong? All the explosions, hundreds of thousands with thoughts, interdiction. Elyn, do you feel like you're dangerous to other people or to yourself, he asked. That's a trick question, I said. I don't think you asked a law professor whether she meets the statutory criteria for commitment in the language of the statute. I'm not sure how you do it, but not that way. No, it's not a trick question, he said. I'm serious. I think you need to be in the hospital. I could get you into UCLA right now, and the whole thing could be very discreet. Ha, ha, ha. You're offering to put me in the hospital? Hospitals are bad. They're mad. They're sad. One must stay away. I'm God, or I used to be. I give life and I take it away. Forgive me, for I know not what I do. I really think a hospital would be a good idea, Martyr said. No, thank you oh so very much, I said. All right then, but if I were you, I'd stay away from work for a while. You don't want your colleagues to see this. Thanks, bangs, bang, bye. See you soon. Oblivious to the look on his face, I left. The next morning, I did drag myself to my office because it was my hideout and refuge. I ran into my colleague Ed in the hall, and he quickly figured out what was happening. Elyn, what the hell's going on? I thought you were kidding at first, but you're not, are you? Does anyone else know about this? Is it okay for anyone else to know? I wouldn't mind telling Michael, I said, not the Archangel one, our colleague. Suffice to say that Ed eventually brought me home, showing the good judgment to follow my doctor's advice rather than tackle me to the ground and take me to the ER, as others, including Ed's internist wife, were recommending. Eventually, I acceded to everyone's demand that I take more meds. I could no longer deny the truth, and I could not change it. The wall that kept me, Elyn, Professor Sachs, separate from the insane woman I had once seen in that mirror long ago, lay smashed in ruins, ending the passage. And then accepting another event pushed me past the point of no return and accepting that I indeed had a mental illness. I got on a new drug. Again, reading from the text. Because of the risks of my meds, Kaplan suggested one of the new class of antipsychotics, a drug called olanzapine. I ended up on a very high dose, like 80 milligrams a day, and it wasn't helping. So we switched to clozapine, which, as you know, is a cumbersome drug, but is sort of the Cadillac in terms of efficacy, and it's worked very well for me. But the change with the Zyprexa at first was fast and dramatic. First, the side effects were much less than with the thiofixine. More important, the clinical result was, not to overstate it, like daylight dawning after a long night. I could see the world in a way I'd never seen it before. The illness was still there, but it wasn't pushing me around as much as it once did. Finally, I could focus on the task at hand, unencumbered by the threat of lurking demons. The most profound effect of the new drug was to convince me, once and for all, that I actually had a real illness. For 20 years, I'd struggled with that acceptance, managing to hold on to the belief that basically there was nothing unusual about my thoughts. Everyone's mind contained the chaos that mine did. It's just they were all better and much at managing it than I was. My problem, I thought, had less to do with my mind than it had to do with my lack of social graces. I wasn't mentally ill. I was socially maladroit. Of course, that wasn't true, and there's no way to understate what a thunderclap this revelation was to me. And with it, my final and most profound resistance to the idea that I had a mental illness began to give way. Ironically, the more I accepted that I had a mental illness, the less the illness defined me. It became accident, as it were, and not essence, at which point the riptide that had kept sucking me in set me free. Ending the passage. I was finally able to integrate the three parts of myself. I was indeed Elyn, the professor, and the lady of the medical charts. It was making friends with the lady of the charts, my mental illness, that allowed Elyn and the professor to flourish and to enjoy the many wonderful relationships that have blessed my life. I have been enormously gratified by how my memoir, The Center Cannot Hold, has been received. With monies from a MacArthur grant, I have founded the Sachs Institute for Mental Health Law, Policy, and Ethics at USC. The goal of the Sachs Institute is to translate ideas into action to better the lives of people with mental illness. I'm very proud to say that folks with lived experience are involved in every aspect of what we do at the Institute. We are your sisters, your brothers, your sons, your daughters, your colleagues, and your friends. We want, in the words of Sigmund Freud, quote, to love and to work. Thank you, University of Mexico Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences, for the work you do in helping me and others like me to find a life worth living. Thank you. Did I take too long? Okay. Hi. So how many minutes do we have?
We have about 15 minutes.
Okay,
This is looking good.
great, thanks. Opening up to questions.
So I have a question.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Professor Sachs, for your presentation. So my question is about the term schizophrenia. And obviously it's a term that is that carries a lot of stigma.
Right.
And there's been a push, for many decades to change the term for the purpose of destigmatizing the illness. And what do you think are the advantages of actually just changing the term for something else? And what are the disadvantages?
I think it's a really good point. It's a very good idea. In fact, I'm involved with a project, a renaming of schizophrenia project. And we've, sought out the views of consumers, their families, doctors, police, religious leaders about the name. And my recollection is that around 75% thought the name should be changed. And the range of possibilities were things like descriptive things like altered perception disorder, or naming it after a person a la Alzheimer's, like Bloyler's or Kreplin's, or a combination of the two. And we surveyed lots of people to see what people wanted. And we believe that the name should be changed, and we haven't, reached a consensus yet about what the new name should be. But words matter. And I think schizophrenia is a problematic word, both because it suggests split personality, which is obviously a different category of disorder, and also because it has a history of tremendous stigma. People with schizophrenia can't work, they can't live independently, that kind of thing. So I think it's a good thing. Do you have any thoughts about that yourself?
So, the term schizophrenia, so I'm aware of many patients and colleagues that immediately connected with split personality. But I mean, as most people in the audience know, schizophrenia was devised by Bleuler. And the actual reason for the term was disintegration or dissociation of cognitive functions. I mean, of functions between cognition, behavior, emotion. That really was the term or the original concept. And I know that in Japan, there's been a push. Actually, they have actually changed the name for schizophrenia. And I think they call it something like disintegration syndrome.
Right.
And what's interesting is that I think that's precisely what Bleuler meant, disintegration syndrome. And of course, the term has been stigmatized and has been linked by popular culture to violence and being, completely unpredictable. But that's a cultural assignment to the term. The term, in my view, doesn't by itself carry that idea. And changing it to a different term like psychosis, and psychosis is already a very stigmatized term.
Right.
And changing terms in mental illness, for example, there was a change to mental retardation that was thought to be less stigmatizing for many, many years. And then recently it was changed again to intellectual disability because it was realized that mental retardation was too stigmatizing. So I'm afraid that with the culture will catch up with whatever term, as long as there's the innate forces that are stigmatizing people with mental illness.
That's a very good point. And I think our work isn't done by changing the name. But if we change the name and we do educate people about what this looks like, what it feels like, and what you can do, what resources are available to address it, we're not going to get very far. I totally agree with that. But, as you say, most people misunderstand what schizophrenia means. And I kind of like the idea of combining a name like Alzheimer's, so Bleuler's or Kreplin's, with a description like disorganized disorder or altered perception disorder or whatever. So you've got both the name, which could turn into the shorthand as Alzheimer's has, and the description. But I think we need to think about that and, get a lot of people, giving their view. I kind of wonder, I think maybe it's been studied, and if it hasn't, maybe it should be, whether changing manic depression to bipolar reduce stigma or changing multiple personality disorder to dissociative identity disorder reduce stigma, because that might give us some insight about whether, it makes real sense to try to change things.
Elyn, Elyn, did you just say a word about the title of your book?
Yes, it's called The Center Cannot Hold, My Journey Through Madness. Center Cannot Hold is a line from a Yeats poem. And it sort of describes what my experience is like, which is the center's not holding. My mind is falling apart, disintegrating, not being held together. So that's why I chose that title. Do you have thoughts about it, Steve?
No.
Okay. Okay.
We were just talking names.
Okay, that was a name. Yeah.
Elyn, it's
I'm
Jeff.
glad I
You
called.
have some questions. They have their hand up. I think James has got a question.
So Professor Sachs, thank you very much for this great talk. And one of the things I think your passages and your commentaries have nicely illustrated was sort of the multimodal approach that seems to have worked for you, which is you've got great social support, medication was helpful, but also the recognition of psychotherapy being helpful. So I just wonder if you could talk a little bit about when we're working with individuals to have them stay in the community and not end up in a hospital setting, how you see that balance, and if there are things that particularly inpatient providers could do to help facilitate that type of environment that might keep people from coming back to the psychiatric center, as we see happen so frequently.
Yeah, I think a multimodal approach is really important. I mean, for me, I think I evaded my great prognosis because of great treatment, and that was both intensive psychotherapy 4 or 5 days a week and medication, wonderful supports, family, friends, loved ones, and a work environment that was both very accommodating and very intellectually stimulating at the same time. So I kind of say more, my mind is work is when I'm writing an argument or a counter argument, the crazy stuff recedes to the sidelines. So I think that work is both my best friend. My mind is both my best friend and my worst enemy, and work really supports that. I sometimes I'll give a talk and someone in the audience will say, and this may be part of what's behind your question, I can afford to see my patients for 30 minutes every 3 months to check on their medication. You see a doctor 4 or 5 days a week. How on earth is my patient supposed to do as well as you? And I say, you're totally correct. The treatment I've gotten has been incredibly helpful, and I'm very fortunate to have the resources to be able to do it. I sort of feel some survivor guilt about that. Not that I'm going to give it back. I'm going to keep whatever benefits that I've been lucky enough to have. But it's hard. It's hard. I've done a study with Dr. Steve Martyr at UCLA on, quote, high functioning schizophrenia. And we've had professionals and managerial and technical and full-time teachers and full-time students. And one day I asked Steve, what percentage of patients with schizophrenia are high functioning in our sense? Again, professional, managerial, et cetera. He said, I don't know. The real question is how many could be if we devoted proper resources. And I thought that was exactly right. And we're just not there yet. And I'm not sure how to get there. Maybe talking about it publicly and stuff like that may help a little bit. But so I think the pandemic has been kind of interesting as well. Not that we like it, but I think more people have experienced fear and anxiety and depression because of it and are able to empathize more with people who have those things just because of their condition. So.
Thank you, James. Anastasia?
Not a question per se, but just a comment. Thank you very much for coming to speak with us. It's been inspiring for me as someone with lived experience of homelessness and bipolar disorder. Who's constantly trying to pursue a higher education. To see someone go through what you did and to succeed has been very inspiring. And I purchased your book to read a few months ago, and I think I will try to finish it soon. So Thank you so much.
Not at all. Feel free to get in touch if you want to connect. I mean, that's true for all of you. But,
Thank you.
Sure.
Thanks, Anastasia. Jonathan Bolton?
Professor Sachs, thank you so much for your presentation. And this is really a follow-up to Dr. Bustillo's question, but it's questioning the premise. And the premise is that there is something called schizophrenia versus schizophrenias, and whether there's a category issue here, and whether we are vulnerable or liable to making generalizations based on one experience when we should be looking at a diversity or a range. And I wondered if you had any question or any comments on the schizophrenias issue.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that. I think there are all sorts of presentations and, what people look like and what people feel and what people can be helped by and what people can do. And it is a mistake just to think there's one thing, because since there's not, we're going to be doing things for everybody that really is only good or works for one person or a couple of people. So I think it's incredibly important to do that, and maybe have different categories, different names, although people may get a little bit obsessional about that or something like that, but it's a thought that might be something we could do. I also think it's, that fact is something that if the public knew would help to stigmatize mental schizophrenia, because they would recognize that there's a whole range of, presentations and outcomes, and that could be useful. So I'm very much in favor of the idea of talking about schizophrenias and not just schizophrenia. So.
Anastasia had a comment as far as umbrella diagnosis goes, kind of like an umbrella.
Oh, that's so interesting. Okay. So you're saying, do I like the idea of an umbrella diagnosis which has different categories underneath it? Yeah, I think that sounds good.
Thank you, Jonathan.
It might be something we study though too, if it really, yeah, okay.
Definitely. Thanks, Jonathan. Dawn Halperin.
Hi, Professor Sachs. My name's Dawn. I don't have a question per se, but I really, how to even say this? I think that as humans, we probably have a handful of people that have been seminal figures in shaping them and influencing the trajectory of their lives. And you've been one of those people to me.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
I thank you. Our team has been so excited knowing that you were coming to speak to us. I think that your generosity in sharing your experience and your visibility and your advocacy has changed so many lives. And I just want to thank you for what you've done and what you continue to do for all of us. I think that the world is a better place because of you.
My goodness. Thank you so much. That's incredibly kind. I really do appreciate that. I really do. And it makes me feel good. And I mean to keep doing it if I can, as long as I can. Thanks.
Thank you, Dawn. Jeff?
Yeah, a comment as well. First, an amazing talk by an amazing person.
Thanks.
I really, just to use the vernacular, you knocked it out of the ballpark.
Thanks.
And we appreciate your taking the time, Elyn, to do this. I also think you reaffirmed what I knew for 15 years, that my good friend Steve Benke is solid gold to the heart. So
absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. He's been my closest friend since, 1983? Is that when we met? So almost 40 years.
I'm not sure we need to get into dates today.
It's true, Steve. You are a solid gold person. It just reaffirms that it's true. And I did really, Elyn, for you to take the time to talk to us. I'm sure I speak for everyone that you made our world a little different and a little better today.
Thank you so much. And actually, speaking with you and hearing your questions and concerns has had the same effect for me. It's been as I say, a win-win. Good for you and good for me.
This is really wonderful. We do have one more comment from James, who asked the question earlier. He says he wants to know the name of the pizza place in New Haven.
I guess it wasn't at Yorkside Pizza, or was it, what's that other one?
Naples.
Was it Naples?
It was Naples.
Naples. Do you know those places?
I'm just well aware of the pizza war in New Haven, so I wanted to see where you guys fell.
Yeah. Yeah, they have those great places where you have to wait online at least an hour to get in. We didn't usually do that one. So is that it, or?
I think we're at the end of the road. On behalf of the department and the University of New Mexico, we thank you very much. You are a gem.
Thank you so much. And I really appreciate all the work you're doing and your interest in these issues and so on. As we say at USC, fight on. Take care. Bye-bye.